Hello, hello, welcome, and we are live yet again. As always, I'm going to be waiting for my co-host to see if she can join when she can, and then we'll get started. We'll be talking as normal about books, writing, publishing, self-publishing, anything and everything in between all those genres. If anybody wants to begin, I always like to ask the question from the start. And my question of the day usually is, what are you reading today? Actually, I have recently began, I'm trying to see if I can see my co-host when she pops in, but I've recently started Circe, if people recognize that title. And again, I'm really early on in that one. Hello!
Hello!
Welcome! See, that wasn't that hard. Well, I kind of will give you like a little idea how I kind of do these things, since this is one of your first, or if not your first time going
It
live.
is my
So,
first.
yay, that's so exciting. Okay, so how I do it is I usually let you begin, since you're my co-host of the week, and you just tell us about yourself, what you write, your spiel, your author spiel, and then I'll do the same on my end, and then from there we just go where the day takes us.
Okay, well, my name is East, and I'm originally from Middlesboro, Kentucky, and I currently live in Knoxville, Tennessee. I'm not quite as accomplished of an author as you are. I've only written one book so
Everybody's at
far.
their own stages. It's fine.
So basically, just a little bit about me. I've been a creative person my whole life. I grew up in a family of creative folks. I also come from a pretty heavy mountain occult background, a very non-traditional religious background. And so that is very much heavily interwoven in all my dance projects, my paintings, my writings. And so what I bring to the table creatively is very much an essence of who I am. Now, what I read, completely not in that realm. I'm very much outside the box in that regard. But basically, I was a coordinator at the local university, working a very academic, intellectual job. And I had been doing creative artistry for over 20 years because I'm in my mid 40s. And I just kind of felt that call that I think a lot of folks felt when COVID came through. And I was working remotely from home. And I really had to sit with those questions that a lot of folks sit with in terms of, am I really living the life that I want to live right now? Is this what I want to do? And so I took a leap of faith and pulled my entire retirement out and just said, I'm going to do it. And I left my career. I'd already been tenured into the state system. And at the same time, I had a business partner just from art. We did a lot of travel with dance and taught workshops together, who also was feeling the same kind of call. And so she creates oracle decks, and she's always had this dream to start a publishing company. And so we kind of did this at the same time, and she signed me on as her first artist. And we actually are probably not a good model of what to do at this point because we're both learning as we go. But that's what got me started into the realm of writing occult fiction. And so just a little quick history about what I write. It's deeply reflective of some of the spiritual-based workshops that I travel around the world and teach. I'm really into as a kid, I was from a very nerdy standpoint, into like the Lord of the Rings and Quest and Dungeons and Dragons and those kinds of things. And I remember being introduced to Joseph Campbell, who wrote The Power of Myth and was this amazing, incredible professor that really influenced myth, or really kind of brought it to the forefront about how myth is really reflective of our spiritual evolution, and often how we can compare the hero's journey to the fool's journey in tarot, which is one of my specialties, and I teach tarot. And so I wanted to take this fusion of the fool's journey with that language and my knowledge of alchemy and the occult, and really kind of blend that into my dreams of being Tolkien. Will never happen, but my dreams of being
Never know. Don't sell yourself short.
So that's just, I write occult fiction, and in terms of what I read, I also write nonfiction too. I'm putting out a nonfiction book in January, but that's a different time, a different subject. But I love to read a lot of romance stuff and high fantasy. I was a huge fan of Anne Rice as a kid because I am older. I could actually say that I read the Vampire Chronicles before movies and those things came out. And so I had my own world kind of what I thought that would look like. And I remember being a little kid and thinking, wow, Interview with a Vampire. This is nothing like the book. This is nothing how I thought
it
this
is kind
should
of
be.
though.
But that's a little quick history of me and where I'm from.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you have examples of your writing, like a cover or image that we can see? Yeah, I always like to ask that. So show and tell.
So I will tell you, I have the art copy. So it has this lovely little sticker here on the front.
That's fine.
But this is Mercy's Quest. And it is lightly illustrated. My illustrator actually also has an incredible story attached to him. He illustrates for Marvel Comics and Heavy Metal Comics.
Okay, I was gonna say it did reminisce of some kind of graphic novel vibes when I saw because I did kind of look back and into your information before we got on here just to see what your books were all about, and I did note that it did give me graphic novel vibes.
His name's Fabio Lestrani, and he also is an internationally well-known tarot deck creator and oracle deck creator as well. And so we were kind of we had some mutual friends, but really didn't know each other in that community in Europe. And so some friends connected us, and he said, sure, I would love to kind of work on this project. And everyone as a first-time author was saying, don't do it. Don't put illustrations in your book. People are going to get confused because it's not a graphic novel. Mm-hmm. But honestly, I didn't listen to that. Now, do I have a couple of regrets? Sure. I've learned a lot of things since then, but I'm glad that I went with that decision because what I've found is, there's a lot of weight in the way that I write, and there's a lot of occult kind of reference that maybe the average person may not know any origins or where I'm coming from. And I feel like the pictures at least it's not enough for the person to not imagine what they think that character looks like to them, but it's just enough to kind of set the tone with what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. And I've seen, not necessarily for more adult literature, illustrations embedded in the story, but I have seen, like, in the back matter, the concept of like the bonus material, that if you buy a printed version, you get the bonus material of, an excerpt or some illustrations or images that you may not find elsewhere. And again, it's one of those hooks that encourage people to buy that extra, the print version versus an ebook.
Sure.
Because you make a little bit more overhead. Well, maybe not. I was going to say, when we talk about like what authors actually make, that gets into a whole other mess of things.
Oh, it does. It absolutely does. I can tell you I'm a big fat zero right now, but I'm okay with that because that's the path I chose. And I knew I could have self-published and probably put myself in a little bit of a better situation. But I really, as an artist of other mediums, I just wanted to bring as many textures to it as I could. And I wasn't overly concerned with what traditional or normative kind of approaches were. I do wish I would have been a little more savvy with that, like in hindsight, but it's my first book and I've got a great attitude about growth with it. So I'm willing and here to just see where it goes.
Hey, no, I understand. My first book, it took me a number of years to just figure out what to do for what to do so that potential readers could actually find it and know what it was about. Because in the beginning, I was just like, "What's marketing? Isn't the book supposed to go out there and just do its thing and be a book?" Yeah, it sometimes takes a little while before things kind of pick up. So it's okay. First books is okay. But for anybody who doesn't know me, my name is Katharine Wibell. I am an author of various epic fantasy series. I have 3 at the moment. And kind of do my back display. The first series I'm going to talk about is my young adult portal fantasy. It's categorized as Noble Brights, a high stakes fantasy. It's set in a multiverse with 12 magical planets and incorporates pretty much any kind of mythological beast being entity that you can think of. It's probably going to have some representation in this series before the end of it. It's just a fun one for me to do and kind of was my big push to become a writer. The first book is the 12 Tasks. The second one's Vagarian Sire, and the third one will be releasing early next year, so I'm excited about that. But my actual debut series, interestingly enough, is a new adult war shifter fantasy. It started with Isara's Claws, the little blue one right here. And that one's set in a kingdom on the verge of war where both the humans and the shapeshifters have to decide if they can put aside their differences to help defend their kingdom against a greater threat. So that's kind of like the beginning premise, though. It gets kind of more convoluted and complex as the series goes on, with the question of deities and are they real and do they interact with society, and some kind of fun underlining notes that way. My third series is for adults. It is a really dark fantasy based around Vikings and Norse mythology. You could almost qualify it as a dark retelling of Norse mythology, at least some of the obscure myths. It's called The Guardian Speaker. You can't really see the covers because they're very dark and this lighting in my office for whatever reason. There are 8 out right now. They're novellas. They're quick reads. And there should be around 16 before the end of it. So halfway there for that series. But that one's a lot of fun as well. I'm obviously very into mythology and kind of the source material of most modern fantasy. So that's where I kind of pull from in my writing.
I love that. That's also my own inspiration too. Folklore. I've put a lot of Dacian folklore from the Carpathian Mountains and woven throughout. So it sounds absolutely incredible.
Yeah. So with your books, you were mentioning that I have a bunch of questions, but like with your books, how did you come about with your initial idea? Like, who's your main character? How did you conceptualize him, her, them? And let me know a little bit about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I was a kid, it started kind of with a personal story. My great grandmother was a practicing mountain healer, mountain witch, whatever you want to call that. And she read tarot cards and tea leaves and all of those things and did a lot of outdoor things that might have been concerning to some of the folks that lived in the area. But she had a box on her mantle. Now she had other boxes, of storage throughout her house that had trinkets or rabbit's feet, different odd and interesting things. But this particular box, we were told, you could never look in this. You can't open it. And so, of course, all the kids had their own little story of what was in the box and made up, what could this be? And so this was the root and foundation of where this story grew from. And so when I made the decision to write, I've done poetry for a really long time. So that also shows pretty heavily in my writing. And I'm actually actively working on evening that out a little bit more. But I come from a poetry background. And my dad actually said, you should write this story. You should root it down and just see where it goes. And that's all that took, that little seed of encouragement. And I'm a heavy dreamer. And so I started having this series of very odd dreams where I felt like Muse came to me through I know this sounds very out there, but through deity, like through this deity, Muse came through in this dream. And it was this very odd dream. And the story was just kind of almost like the fuel was put on the fire. And then I woke up and then it just started pouring out of me effortlessly, almost as if it wasn't coming from me. And I had to learn actually later that it doesn't always work that way.
That's true. That's true.
But that kind of started, the story of where it comes from. And so basically in my story, Mercy, the main character, she discovers that what's inside of this box is a human finger. And it takes her down this journey of trying to figure out, who does this belong to? What does this mean? And she discovers this whole group of elitist occultists that are trying to kind of consume power from a source that's very connected to her origins and her family. One of the main characters and one of the voices of reasons is Lucifer in this book, which has also been very interesting to field when people read it, because there's an intention with that will play out as the series goes on. And you'll also find that Mercy discovers she's not quite who she thought that she was, maybe not even human, perhaps. And so there's also space and planetary elements. In my book, Saturn represents the final gate, the final end of where you go to recycle through into your next either parallel dimension or your next version of self, or recycle back to Earth. And so it really talks about the whole concept of soul ascension and descension. and who you are within that journey, and what's the point of it all. And so you have this character kind of discovering who she really is. She may or may not be tied to a deity as well. And you see her finding these pieces through different relationships with different people as a quest, as one would in a quest. So really the people that she meets along the journey, it's just as rich, that experience. And to not give too much away, it's a trilogy, but there are already plans for 3 spin-offs of some of the supporting characters that are in this book. And again, it's heavily rooted in Solomon. There's a lot of references to Solomon and a lot of the folklore and myth of his private school in the Carpathian Mountains that we can find in mythology everywhere. And then, as we know, the devil has always been known to have a skull also in that area. And so you'll see that come through in this story as it moves along. And so much like you, there's lots of references to different mythological deities. And it's not from any one specific place. I'm trying to kind of show the concept of the archetypal presence of each of these things and what they're bringing, no matter if it's Hellenistic or if it's coming from Christian folklore. I just really want to show kind of how the soul archetypally identifies. And my dog is actually running crazy behind me right now. So
that's fine.
Stop, Daisy.
He's not our first canine guest that has popped up on these. So, but no, that's really neat. I actually know another author that I grew up with, and she identifies as a kitchen witch. And when she writes fantasy, she writes adult romance fantasy inspired by Celtic lore and fae, but the first main character was kind of like almost a mirror to herself because it was a kitchen witch persona, and delved from there into more of the Celtic lore of fae and the deities in that culture too. But, that's always just kind of interesting to see where different authors get their ideas. Is it something that, they are in contact with regularly, or something just very foreign? But when I started writing the first book, Azara's Claws, it was also inspired, kind of what you mentioned about some kind of dreaming. Well, it was inspired by a very vivid dream that I couldn't put aside, and I kept going back to it and kept going back to it, and the story kept building out in my head and building out, and all of a sudden I was like, I need to write this down. This is a thing. This is going to happen.
It's pretty amazing how Muse comes through like that too. And I've taught workshops on the spiritual platform about working with Muse, because I feel like intuitive blocks, creative blocks, emotional blocks, they kind of have that same emotional connection and kind of how our willingness to work with Muse. And I've always found it fascinating when I speak with other authors, artists, dancers, musicians, to what they think about that. Like, what's your relationship with Muse? How do you see that come in, through you? And is it normally in dreams, or do you feel it, in a waking conscious state? I'm just curious to what your answer to that would be.
For me, when it comes with stories, I mean, developing and conceptualizing different storylines and plot lines, it can come to me at any point of the day. I try to be as much of a full-time author and artist as I can, so my mind is pretty much pre-programmed to be, thinking about just my genre, my writing and everything. And even if I'm driving in the car or taking a walk somewhere, I may be working out different plot points or plot lines as doing that. So there is a steady flow of creativity that comes with being open to just, thinking about it, allowing that creativity flow to get to you. And then the trick is, can you get to your computer or your notepad quick enough so you don't forget what you came up with? Can you make those notes quick enough, or are you going to forget?
I think for me, when I'm driving, I'll have a lot of things come through when I'm driving. So I'll try to voice clip the note, and then an hour when I'm settled and grounded, I'll go back to that note. And only 50% of the time do I really retain the original kind of, zest that came with the inspiration. So I'm still struggling. You were talking about kind of keeping that creative flow open and knowing your patterns and knowing how to stay tuned into your genre. I'm still trying to identify that with myself. And that's been a little bit of a struggle, because when I wrote the first book, I was working a full-time academic job, and it was just an outlet. And so the energy and the relationship with the writing was very different. And then when I decided to approach it full time, I felt a lot of pressure, and I was going back and forth into deep blocks. And so I've been really focused on different ways, or what works for me, and finding that pathway. How do I keep that creative flow open for me? Because I'm clearly an all over the place person. I'm ADD and just have had those kinds of struggles growing up as a kid, as some artists do. And so it's been interesting going from a very structured life and being an artist with a very structured life into a full-blown creative life, and really trying to who am I? I don't know who I am anymore.
Well, I mean, as everything, depending on you as an individual and depending on your approach to writing, some people have, they know it exactly off the cuff, and other people do. They need to figure that part out along the way. I know when I was doing my first series, I was writing a story that I was passionate about, and thankfully it appears now that other people enjoy it, but it took me a while to figure out how to categorize it better, how to reach out to the right people, because I wrote what I wanted, but it didn't really fit into the modern trendy niches that were out there at the time. And so it takes a little while to kind of figure out who you are, how do you identify as a writer, and then of course learning all the plethora of just terms and genres and subgenres and the tropes that relate to it, that you can like click with someone else and be like, oh yeah, that's something that I would enjoy, or I would give it a try, or something like that. So it takes a little bit of time getting that process started for some people. Other people, it's like off the bat, they know.
Good to know, because I'm still kind of struggling. Because at first I thought occult fantasy fiction, and then I realized some folks have a really uncomfortable relationship with the word occult. And it just comes from a space of just ignorance, just not knowing, that's a very broad reach. I also didn't really feel like witch literature really covered what I was doing. And so I'm still struggling to find my community. I will tell you, when other pagan authors like Jamie Elford or Eileen Halverson and Silver Ravenwolf, all these really incredible, well-noted people, when they've read it, they've saw kind of the Easter eggs of richness. And so it's really just been about making it more reachable, because I definitely am catering more to a specific space where fiction isn't as, I don't want to say popular, because that's not really what I'm trying to do, but for lack of a better way of putting it, it's not as popular as nonfiction. And, the pagan community really grabs onto nonfiction or short story. And so I'm just really struggling with probably finding my crowd in all of this, but I've enjoyed kind of the process of it. I'm going to a lot of conferences. I'm trying to hit both sides of the table and just really make sure that I'm, reaching people that go beyond that community. I actually just went to France for a month to study some Christian Gnostic mysticism, which is something I've studied for 20 years for another project that I'm working on. And even in that group, I realized, as we're all traveling together on a bus, they're like, let me buy the book and I'll just read it as we travel, which is no pressure to me. I would rather not be there when they're reading. But I got a lot of really great feedback from a crowd that isn't typically the group that I market or promote to. And so just trying to stay open and understanding. And I'm glad that you said that some folks don't know immediately where that is.
Oh no. There are those, I know those, there are a handful I could probably name off the cuff that they got it. But because I was not an author who wrote to market, as they say, it was kind of hard to figure out what market to put my book in when it was all said and done. But with that said, I wanted to ask, because it sounded like you are through a small press publishing.
Yes.
Okay, so I didn't know how much control you have over your own marketing, and that I don't know. Do you have control of adjusting categories on Amazon? Because I know that's a big thing for me. All the categories Amazon always tries to stick me in aren't exactly the best for me, and so having that control to them be like, no, I would prefer you to be put here. That has helped me a lot, be able to be found by the right people. And I just don't know how much control marketing wise you have as a small press author.
So she gives me 100% creative control. The only kind of caveat in the contract is that we have to talk it through. I mean, she has to feel comfortable with what's going on, and we've had a really great working relationship in other ways. And so far everything's worked out really well. Illustrations were 100% my control. Cover was 100% my control. Editing, we kind of went back and forth a little bit on, but I'm okay with that because I'm more into the visual or the visceral experience of it. And so but yeah, luckily, because that's one of the reasons why I did not want to publish. I didn't want to be in a position where I didn't have, and I've heard all these stories, and we know just as we're speaking right now, publishing is still changing. Things are changing.
Yeah, always, every day.
Yeah. And so, I was a little reluctant to go that route, but she has been really gracious in giving me, that and a reasonable percentage, really an outrageous amount of percentage in terms of what goes in my pocket. Cause we did this together to learn together. Now, what she does for future artists going forward, I'm sure will reflect something a little bit different, but it just so happened to work out from a destiny standpoint where both of us kind of met at the same time, trying to accomplish different things that complemented each other.
That's fantastic. But I wanted to, I guess the reason why I was curious about that particular question of your own artistic control, especially, on the Amazon bracket, because Amazon is such a forefront powerhouse for books indie and above, or indie or other, I should say. But it is so essential to make sure, at least on that platform, how to reach your right readers. And one of the things that I found helpful fairly recently was I stumbled across a book, and I think I'll message it to you if you are curious. Just have to look and just verify the title. But I think it was called 7-Figure Fiction. I think that's the name of the book. But in it, it was talking about how, and the concept of how to make your blurb, so the little pitch on your Amazon page, worded in a way that maximizes the relatability of your story to people, so that maybe your character is a single mom, and though that doesn't play a huge role in your fiction, but if you mention that, all of a sudden you have a bunch of single moms that are like, oh, that's neat. I can relate to that, even if they may not relate to the fantasy or the occult or all these other genres. That just gets them curious about your book enough that they may buy something outside of their typical genres and be able to reach a wider range of readers. And it was just a cool approach on how to think of these. I think she called them universal fantasy ideas, and just a way to help your book become or maximize its potential to be marketable.
Yeah, I would love to check that out for sure.
Yeah, well, after this, I'll have to go and pull that up and just make sure, but I'm pretty sure it's called 7-Figure Fiction. I'm horrible in names, so I have already forgotten the author's name. It's just because I am bad with names. The only names I remember are my book characters, and that's probably pretty sad.
That's actually great. I can relate to that.
Well, good. But yeah, I just like that concept of, even though you have your core premise and your core themes and your core tropes, to be able to find other things that will help reach a wider audience, or may relate to a wider audience that you as an author may not have known to just sneak a couple of those words into your blurb or your pitch or whatnot, and it can just help you out that way find readers.
Yeah, because it's hard, especially, that was my first blurb. I've not written, that many, and
that's a whole art form.
I was like, whoa. I mean, that was the worst of the entire process. If anybody was to ever ask me, I was like, how do you sum up not only a book, but a book that somebody's going to really have, because I'll just tell you, it's a lot of world building in this first book. And again, in hindsight, I wish I would have added some more things to kind of make it a little richer. Because in book 2, it's just absolutely taken off into this beautifully high fantasy kind of direction. I wish I could have been more strategic, I think, in putting that together. I'm still happy with the way that it came out, but thinking broader, I guess, like what you're talking about, and learning how to, oh, my dog, sorry. Learning how to reach different folks, and I was like, how do you sum up this incredibly large world? And I did the best that I could, but
Oh yeah, no, and again, there's such a large learning curve, at least for me, in my opinion, between your first book and getting just that whole understanding, that whole process, everything from conception to publishing and beyond, the marketing, because it never ends. But I'll be honest, and I've said this before, that my first book, A Stars Clause, was initially meant to be a standalone, and so the way I wrote it, it kind of has an ending where you probably feel pretty, complete about it, and it gives you a little tease that there's more to come. But I learned how to be better about writing it in a series when I started the second book, and that one flowed really quickly into the third into the fourth, and so I've taken that process of just making sure I hook the reader, keep them knowing that there's more to come directly. But again, my first book was not necessarily originally intended to be. It was halfway through, 3/4 of the way through, I realized it was going to be a series, but I already had the story pretty much out there, and I was going to be true to my original story. And for that, thinking about like the regrets of how you approach your first novel. Well, my first one was written in a way that it slides into a young adult category. But the other three, I would categorize as new adult because they are darker, they deal with grittier subjects and a little more adult themes. And so because of that, it's weird. I have this weird series where the first one, most people just read and they're like young adult. And I'm like, just know, I categorize the series as a whole as new adult because it gets a little darker as the series progresses. And that's not a recommended thing by any means. You want the series to be, bundled in a way and flowing in a way and meshed better than the way I guess I did it. But you learn as a writer. And so because of, the stumbling blocks along the way, I think my next two series are improving and kind of at least not making the same mistakes. They may be making other mistakes, but they're not making the same mistakes because that's part of the writing process. You get better.
Sure. I'm anxious to see where it continues for me when I'm at the point that you're at with with all your series and everything that you've got going on, because I think that's just fantastic to be able to say that you already have all of that under your belt so far.
Well, I've also started a while ago, and I see a comment, and I try to read, if I have certain comments pop up, I'll read them loud, because when I repurpose this in a couple of weeks on YouTube, people can't see the comments, but I did see one talking about, thank you, good story too, even for older audiences. I'm assuming you were talking about the Incarn Saga, so we'll go with that. But thank you. But yeah, I mean, I've been writing, my first book was published in 2016. I think that's correct. So I've been, publishing for a number of years at this point. So, and with the novellas being the fact that they are smaller, they're quicker to turn around a book, at least for me. But I'm definitely not a person who can pop out a book a month like some people. I drop my jaw whenever I hear an author can do that. Kudos for you. It takes me a little longer, but it's definitely also taking me a lot of time to figure out my structure, my flow, my processes, where I'm able to put out multiple books a year efficiently.
So can I ask you, this was something that I did not take very seriously, if I were being honest, when I first put this book out, covers. Yes. I would say probably the most constructive feedback that I've gotten is my cover. Some folks, and when they read it, they get it, but in terms of like not having read the book, what are your thoughts? Because I had a publicist at one point that I worked with that works with other authors, and that was her feedback as well. And did you look at the trends? Did you look at the trends in your genre? And so what are your thoughts on covers?
I do actually believe that is very important. My debut book, actually, the cover did not look like this one by any means. I wanted to do what I wanted to do, and also crickets for like the first year or so because the cover was wrong. It wasn't genre appropriate. It wasn't hitting what was trendy at the time. And the nice thing about authors who have control of their own material and work is that you can adjust your books to the trends cover-wise whenever you need to. And the big publishing houses do that. I mean, look at Harry Potter series. How many editions of that cover has gone out there because trends change? The book's the same, the trends change. So I had to go back and do a little more research and came up with that series, which was a little more on trend at the time, and I'm sure in a number of years I'll have to go back and refresh it. But going forward, I do want to be aware of what is popular, what people like in whatever genre that I'm trying to focus on as my primary. Even still, it's that little subtle trick of you want to be as close to on the nose of being on the trend, yet unique enough where people aren't like, I'm pretty sure I've seen that cover before, because you want it again to pop as well. So it's, as all things, a work. It's something you just have to kind of learn, and I hope to continue to get better as I go along, trying to figure out how to approach the book covers for different series. But and you just have to do your own due diligence research. Also make sure you're comfortable with whatever you're putting out there, because it is your product in the end. And do your research if you're the one in control of the cover designers, just to make sure you reach out to the right person for the right project. Doesn't mean you can't use the one you want for a different project that's a better fit, but you just have to kind of be aware of all that. And it's a process. It's a trick.
Sure. So what do you think about, how are you with Audible? Have you done any conversions to Audible, or what are your thoughts about that?
That is a long-term process that I'm working on. All three of my series right now are being converted to audiobooks. I have obviously different people on each series. And I'm trying to spread the gamut because I want to know what works best. So my young adult is going to have a female narrator. My Viking one has a male narrator, and then my debut series is a voice cast. So each character is going to have a different voice actor, actress performing.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, so they're all going to be a little off, but I had to, and I have reasons why. Like, I chose my young adult one. It's, all my series, though they, at this point, feature a female main character, and you go through her eyes. My young adult one just felt right with a female narrator because she's a young girl. She goes through, the coming of age process through her teen years, and it would be a little weird for me to have a male narrator to do her role.
Sure.
On the flip side, even though I have a female lead in my Viking series, I ended up working with a male narrator because most of the cast outside of probably 2 are male. So even though my main character is female, it just worked better to choose a male narrator for something like that, just because, again, trying to get the sounds, and you kind of want women to sound right and men to sound right, and everything in between to sound correct. So again, it's one of those things I'm testing out right now. The only 2 that I have are my first 2 novellas of The Guardian Speaker, and they're out. And so, but that's been relatively new. Like the first one released at the end of August, and the second one end of last month. Oh, but I'm hoping in the next few years you'll see a little bit more out there, but it takes a while, depending on the length of the project and the complexity. My voice cast one is the one who I hired first. It's probably going to be the first novel to release, because there's so many actors, and they have to, now you have to voice splice and make sure all the sound editing is correct. And so it's a longer process to do that one. Hoping it'll release next year. Crossing fingers. So is that something you're interested in?
I'm definitely interested in it because I'm involved in artistry. I'm a dance teacher, and I do a lot of performance art and things like that. Audiobooks are the way to go for me a lot of the time, because I can do that when I travel sometimes 6 hours out of town for shows, and I get super excited to drive those drives because I can listen to a book the entire way down. But it wasn't until, audiobooks are obviously something that I've utilized a lot. But when I just started Sandman, Neil Gaiman's Sandman, and
I haven't read it. I kind of want to read it. I did see the series first, though.
Honestly, I did too. And a friend of mine was like, you've got to just go through it. And I was like, I really don't have the time. And she was like, listen to the audiobooks. It was high production quality, sound effects, full cast, all of that. And so I get really excited.
I noticed that one because there is something called the Audies, and they describe it as the Oscars for audiobooks. And at least the second collection of Neil Gaiman's Sandman was nominated for last year's fantasy category. I can't remember if he was the winner or if it was one of Sanderson's books, but I obviously that has a high performance value.
Right,
so
right.
Interesting.
I was like, that's the mecca of like, the reason I was so interested in that though is because my husband and my brother are both musicians and in sound and recording and engineering and in that, not in the book realm of life, but more in the musical realm. And so I'm trying to kind of research it because I'm heavily resourced, in a different way, and just wondering, is this one of those things that I try to do, or do I wait and go through the appropriate channels of people that know what they're doing, because I'm just really eager and excited to get it out on audio.
Well, and that's the thing is if you decide to use, and I know there are other platforms cropping up, but if you use the ACX, which is Audible's production side of their platform, and if you decided you wanted to go do it yourself, you have obviously, there are three main choices. And I, again, trying to test different things out. We're seeing what works best. There's one, obviously, where you hire a narrator or producer, as they're called, in that platform. And the producer, you pay, in full their fee. That's expensive, but then that means you get maximum income, maximum, I'm losing my train of thought on what's the word? I can't put the word on my tongue, but the percentage that authors get, their cut, is the highest if you go that route. Then you could do the 50-50 share that I'm doing right now with another one, and that way you don't pay the producer at all, but you have a deal for 7 years. You split your cut with your producer, and so there's pros and cons to everything. One is you're out of pocket initially, but hopefully you can make it plus some. The other one is you're not out of pocket, but you have, a deal with someone for up to 7 years at minimum. And then the third is you do it yourself. But the trick is, I know I would not be comfortable doing it myself because I don't have the tech. I don't have a sound area. I don't know how to do the sound editing, and it would sound very bad.
What's interesting about Knoxville, we have Scripps and Discover and all of the murder television stuff. We have lots of voice actors here. It's just really odd that Knoxville, Tennessee, of all cities in the world, has this kind of mass plethora of voice actors. So, and I do a lot of work with the local like indie film stuff. We'll do like independent film festivals, and a lot of these folks, that's what they do full time, is voice acting. So it's definitely something I'm just now exploring. So
yeah, and that's I mean, again, even if you do go through the Audible side of things, you can hire and reach out to a narrator and hire them direct. I think they just have to make sure they have their account set up. But if you found someone on the street and you're like, oh, I really like you, you're a fantastic person, you want to do it, you make your verbal deal, then you go on ACX, you could pitch, ask them direct the routes, but ask them direct and get someone that way. Or they have hundreds, thousands, probably thousands of narrators that you can go through that are already part of their system, and you can find which ones are available, and they have like a series of requests if you want people to pitch to you, and you put an excerpt out, and you'll have a bunch of different people trying to audition for you. Yeah, so you pick, I think it's 2 to 3 pages. They can be different clips, but it gives you an idea of, let's say, maybe some dialogue or an action scene or whatnot. And if you have open auditions, narrators who, wanting to fill their time will come out and find you, and you, based on your genre, what you're asking for. And in that case, you can say, I want to prefer a male around this age with this accent, with this, or I'm trying to have a main character that has this personality. This is what I want. Can you do that? And these are already kind of there for a narrator to find and say, oh, I fit that. And that's actually how I was approached for my Viking series. I put the pitch out. I was holding open auditions, and the British actor George Blagden, who acted in the TV series Vikings, came up and was like, can I narrate your book? And I was like, okay.
Let me see.
Well, I did. I went through the whole channels, and I was like, to be fair, I want you to audition. I want you to do this. We talked about it. He auditioned, and it really did work well. And I was just like, okay, thank you. So, but you can have auditions there where people come to you, so you don't have to do all the work unless you really want to sound. And then you can do the opposite. You can go to each narrator of a certain category and listen to their examples and hopefully find someone that you're like, I like you. I like your work. I like your sound. Let me see if I can work a deal with you. So there are a bunch of different ways. That platform is trying to make it as accessible as possible, knowing that audiobooks are expensive if you choose the I'm paying up front.
Right.
It's process.
So what is your thoughts on conferences, like traveling to different, what do you think about that? Because I'll just tell you, as someone that's been doing that, I'm on the fence about it, because in certain respects, obviously it's brought new readers, but most often it's brought networking opportunities with other authors, which is great. But I don't know. What's your thoughts about that?
I guess it depends on the type of conference, or if you're talking about just conferences in general, or you're talking about like cons and festivals.
Specifically cons. Okay. I mean, yeah.
I split them in slightly different conferences. When I think of a word conference, I'm thinking of something that's educational. I'm going to be sitting in seminars listening to, marketing and advice on, different socials, and trying to rub elbows with other publishing houses or agents. And I see a lot of value for conferences. Obviously, the biggest indie conference internationally happened, I think, last week. Oh, my weeks are blurring together. Last week in Vegas, because it's 20 books to 50K. And there was a whole bunch of authors from the book talk community that attended, and everybody seemed to get a lot of value out of that. But that's education, not for sales. Sure. When it comes to cons and festivals, I can see value down the line. I feel like there needs to be a certain threshold of the amount of books you have. Because for me, and this is just my philosophy, I know other authors who have their first book and they go to them regardless. But if you have at least the start of a series, and let's say 3 books or more there, if you'll often be able to sell maybe book 1 to someone there, and then they may double back and buy 2, 3, or 4. And as one of the sayings that I like in the writing community, it's easier to sell 10 books to one person than 1 book to 10 people. So if you have more books already out, especially if you're a series writer, that you could probably make a higher profit margin attending festivals than it is when you're trying to pitch 1 book.
Just a book, yeah.
Yeah, so it's something that I do see that can have value, but it's something I'm not sure I would try to do. I kind of dabbled with it with book 1, but then I stopped and held back because I wanted to make sure I had enough books out there. And personally, I wanted to have a couple different series out there just because I wanted, to be able to connect with different readers and say, well, buy my first books or buy 1 series. If you like that, there's another one, come back tomorrow kind of approach. And that's different than a true book signing, because a book signing is maybe you with the world or with the purpose of people coming in to have books signed. And that one, depending on if you're paying for a booth fee, where you're doing it, you may have a higher profit margin with only 1 book if you're doing a book signing, when you have that kind of control. So book signings, I think you could start at any time. Obviously, more books the better. When it comes to paid festivals and cons, if you're trying to have a booth, I would definitely recommend having multiple books, and then conferences are great educational resources. And it's something that I would like to save some money to attend some of the bigger conferences next year and see if that can help me become a better marketer of my work.
Sure.
So, okay, wow. We're getting close to the end of the hour. Okay, so let me ask you, there was something I was going to ask, and now I'm trying to go back to it. You have 1 book out, and you said you're trying to make it into a trilogy with potential spin-offs on the side. So do you know your plots for book 2 and 3 and the other? Okay,
So
or you just feel like three's
I'm
good?
more of a pantser than a plotter, but I have to plot to a certain extent. So I have a very loose structure of where we're going, what the goal is, and what needs to be covered. But my process so far, because I'm almost through with book 2, is just to kind of redefine more specific structures with real-time writing. Does that make sense? So I have kind of a loose idea where it all is going to keep me focused kind of towards the end game, but I refine it as I go along to keep myself organized. I love these people that can have 35 post-its or a million hundred post-its on a wall. And like, you know, that is so overwhelming for me. I wish that I could get it that detailed, like all the way through, but I just don't function that way.
Hey, no, every writer is different and every approach is different. So you just have to find what works for you. And that's great. Like, for me, I kind of fall in between because I know pretty much the main structure of my books, the main characters, the main plot points, and the climax area, and how I want to wrap it up, how many books are in the series, etc. Those big points. But I do allow myself the freedom that as I'm writing and filling in all these storylines, that if a subplot comes along, a new character crops up, a new backstory kind of emerges, that's okay. Weave it in there. That's kind of the fun part of writing. You don't have to be extremely rigid in your approach. You can be if that works for you, but you can also be very flexible too.
I feel like if I could be more rigid, I'd feel a little calmer. I feel like I'm such a manic creator. I'm like, oh, 3:00 in the morning, I've got to get this out of me. I'm just wondering, does that ever stop? I don't know. I'm just kidding. I know.
For me, I've always been on the more structured side, and it's harder for me to allow myself to be flexible. But that's just the way I've come in. I've always been a very structured individual. But like I said, each author is different, and you would have to probably ask a couple different authors and see everybody's opinions, because I'm sure there is somewhere that's going to say, yeah, it gets better, it gets easier. You become more structured, and other people are probably no. So it's such an individual thing. Yeah. Now, since we're actually towards the end of November, there are a lot of people who were doing NaNoWriMo. Mm-hmm. Is that something you've ever considered? Yeah, okay. I haven't. Now, do
I consider it? Sure. Am I going to do it like realistically? Probably not.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't remember exactly what the minimum requirement is. I think it's 40,000 words.
It's a lot.
It's 40,000 words. And the funny thing is, like, I sat down and based off the last couple weeks, if I had truly dedicated myself, I could have hit 40,000 words, but 40,000 words, I write big books. So 40,000 words is not a book. It would give me a good step into that, but it's not my book. So when people are like, I wrote a book in November, I was like, my books are way too big. I would have to be writing every day for most of the days, not doing any marketing, not doing any social things. I would be absolutely miserable. It wouldn't be worth it. But I do like the concept of challenge. I like to rise to a challenge, so I can totally see why this particular NaNoWriMo helps so many people, because it just gives them an excuse, a reason, a challenge, a little push to sit down and get words to paper. But I couldn't do it. I could meet those goals, but just knowing that I had that set, no. That's just
it would just be an extra. I also have this tendency to edit as I go, which I'm trying really, really hard to get out of. And so things like that, like goal-oriented, short time frame, kind of, that's just more pressure I don't need on top of what I'm already putting on myself in that moment. So,
hey, no, I mean, editing as you go is not a bad thing to do, and everybody has to decide, what structure, how they want to do it, because going back over, I like to actually go over my chapters a couple times before I put them to bed, just to make sure I read through them a couple times, make sure I'm catching any of the big issues, and I'll stop. Depending on like my larger work, I may write 10 chapters and then pause, and read through the 10 just to make sure there's a flow going through before I start with 11. Just again, because I don't want to forget something that I meant to put in chapter 3, and I'm here at chapter 40, and I'll be like, no!
Yeah.
I forgot. So I do like to do a little bit, at least, editing as I go. So that's not a bad thing at all. So, okay, so you have, with your plan, when do you think or hope to release your second book?
Well, we're hoping solstice of next year, book 2 will come out. Summer solstice, which is June the 21st, and winter solstice, book 3, because I'm
like
kind of moving all that through. And my editors and everybody are kind of in place to help with that timeline. It's really just about me getting them the work. So that's what, and I also have a quarterly digest that I'm putting out that's nonfiction, and that's kind of going along with this. And so that will be out the 1st of February.
Ooh, fun. That's fun. That's a lot of projects. That's fun.
Yeah.
But also the fact that you can set your due date so far in advance, I wish I could. I never know when my books will be ready. And so I'm really bad about setting a release date in advance and being able to market to that release date, because I'm always worried that I'm not going to be ready in time, or there's going to be a hiccup.
It's a real fear.
I also don't want to pick a date and then be ready 6 months early and be like, I should have just released it just now. Get it out there. So maybe that's impatience, but
I will tell you too, for me, it's also about, I had already had this mapped out, and it's not like I'm trying to figure out what this story is at this point in the process, but I really don't know. Like, I have, of course, lots of ideas for future things that have nothing to do with this project. I have no idea like how I would handle that, honestly. I don't know.
It's okay. We're all learning. We're all trying to improve, and that's
just
why
I swim and figure it all out.
Well, that's why I like connecting with other authors, because sometimes someone else will give me an idea. I'm like, you know what? I should try this. This is a good thing. And someone else, for instance, one of the authors here, AP Beswick, he's really big in the Kickstarter campaigns to help fund, because he's indie, to help fund his releases. And so he's been helping me a little bit, and I'm hoping to kind of be able to use that technique for my next release in the beginning of the year. But again, that's planning it out. And then again, when it comes to, on the flip side, the audiobooks, so I have the next book, again, by George Blagadon, aka Athelstan from the Vikings. When he's ready for it, it just drops. You can't plan for those, and it's kind of like, I'm bad about releases. I really wish I was better about releases. I wish I could like notify the world and be like, it's here, and everybody know. But I'm really bad about that. So that's something I would like to improve upon. What would be the one thing you would like to improve upon as a writer?
Gosh. Clear narrative. I mean, I feel like that's really terrible to say about myself, but again, I'm a storyteller. I've not really identified as a writer until recently. And so when I say I have editors, not really heavy on from a developmental standpoint, but really, to be honest, from grammar and that kind of thing. And, I've always been someone that's been really invested in visual and movement art. And so tell in oratorial stories, like I said, I'm a comfortable storyteller. I love to get up in front of people and talk and tell stories, but I also write that way, and that's not necessarily the best way to write. And so my improvement really is in my technique as a writer. I mean, I obviously need to improve in everything, but my focus is really on making sure that I feel like my stories are great, and I'm so passionate about them that I often feel like I'm not doing my characters justice because of not having that knowledge. And it's really just a passion towards them and trying to, as if they're real to me, and they are very real to me, of giving them the voice that they deserve to have through my story. That's my focus right now. And I have a wonderful editor who is a retired teacher, who kind of teaches me as she edits. this is this, and you might want to read this rule and kind of understand where I'm coming from. Because if I were being honest with you, school was not something that was fun for me. I mean, I'm, again, a very visual person and unique in that regard. And so it's really nice to have the kind of relationship where I can receive that kind of feedback from her and her help me along. And so that's honestly what I'm really looking at right now, is just to be a better technical writer. So I'm making sure that that clarity is there.
And that's something like I think all authors can benefit from. I know, coming from, I guess I can only speak for myself, but yeah, you do become so intimate with your storyline that, and it happens that when you have it, read over, maybe it's your editor, or you have betas or alpha readers or whatever you have along your processes, it's good to have people pause and be like, hey, you need to clarify this. And one of them, who's listening right now, one of them always says it's because you're so intimate with your characters and your story that you forget sometimes that not everybody sees what you see and hears what you hear unless you explain it a little more succinctly. So that is something I think that a lot of authors struggle with and always, hopefully, continue to try to improve. Yeah. So since we've rounded the end of the hour, let me ask you, is there anything that you would want a potential reader to know about you, your work, your processes, anything at all that you haven't talked about at the moment that we never covered?
I think I just want to reiterate that I do live my life as a spiritual person, a mystical person, and I spend a lot of time living that experience, and that's very palpable in the stories that I write. And so if people are interested in feeling that depth and the reach into like soul evolution and hero's quest, because I feel like primarily that's the stories I've always told, is journeys and quest. I feel like you're going to find a level of realness, even though it's fiction, that can be relatable to anybody. And anytime I've mentioned a country or anything in my book, I've experienced that because I'm a traveler as well. And so I try to bring as much richness as I can into that space. And if people love texture and richness and trying to kind of understand why they're moving through the world, I feel like that they would really like anything that I would write in that regard.
Great. I love that. Now, one final question, actually, because I forgot to ask this earlier. Where can people find you in your work? Like, do you websites, socials?
Sure.
Where can people find you in your work?
So obviously on TikTok, you can find my website, which is theartisteast.com. East is in the direction EAST. I'm very country, so sometimes it's hard. And we'll reference that, I'm sure, in the comments. And I'm on all the socials. And if you Google, we're globally distributed in every online source worldwide. So you can find Mercy's Quest anywhere that online books are sold. And I think that pretty much covers it.
Perfect. Well, what I'll do is when I repurpose this in a few weeks, I'll make sure I can kind of try to collect some of your information and post them below on YouTube so people can easily find you when they want to learn more. But thank you so much for coming out and chit-chatting with me this week. And if you ever want to do this again, especially, when you have a few more books released next year, come and just reach out. I do these once a week.
Great. I would love to. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, and have a lovely Thanksgiving since it's Thanksgiving week.
You as well.
Bye.
Bye.